Hey everyone, this is the sig-auth meeting for June 23rd, 2021. Get started real quick. Jordan's not here to, wait, can you all see my screen? Or did it stop sharing my screen? Jordan opened the initial PR for PSP. Hey, there's Tim. Tim, did you want to talk about this PR? I actually have no idea what's going on with this PR.
Sure. So yeah, this is the initial PR for the pod security admission controller, aka PSP replacement. This is trying to lay a lot of the kind of framework and skeleton for implementing the controller. And our hope is that once this gets merged, then we can parallelize a lot of the remaining work. There's a bunch of to-dos that were left in this PR, and we're hoping that folks can help with some of those PR to-dos. It also has a framework for implementing what we're calling checks, which is each of the kind of controls being checked. So for instance, I think we added a SE Linux, run as non-root, and maybe allow privilege escalation checks in this one, but we need to go back and add all the other controls as well. And yeah, we'll file issues for all of those remaining tasks once this merges. Yeah, hoping to get this in pretty soon so that we can proceed with the rest of that and get it all done by code freeze. One thing to note on this, it is a 36,000 line PR with 1,800 files. The vast majority of that is generated YAML for test data. So for each check, we add a set of what we're calling fixtures. This is all Jordan's brainchild. So a bunch of fixtures in code. And those are used to run unit tests and integration tests, and then also generates the YAML that can be used to test external implementations of this. So that's where most of that is coming from. So I recommend, if you want to take a look at this, definitely go by commit by commit, and those are intentionally ordered in kind of like dependency ordering, so they make sense.
So Tim, what do you guys need help with to get this merged within the next 2 weeks or so?
So definitely, if anyone has time to kind of take a look at this, that would be helpful. David volunteered to be the primary approver or reviewer on this, so we've booked some time with him this Friday. If you're interested in doing kind of more of a detailed walkthrough, let me know, and I can see about getting you added to that.
Yeah, sure, I wouldn't mind. Is it just meant to be a small set of people, very directed?
Yeah, I want to kind of keep it sort of focused, but yeah, if you're interested, maybe reach out to me on Slack afterwards. We can talk about it.
Cool. Is there anything other than review that you need help with?
So again, once this merges, we'll add all of the issues to track the remaining tasks and all of the to-dos in there. And we'll definitely be looking for help implementing a lot of those. If you want, if anything seems particularly exciting, or you want to kind of get started on that, again, reach out to me on Slack, and you can probably start working on some of that before this merges if you want. Some of the pieces are more likely to change than others.
Cool. Well, this is very exciting. Does anyone have any comments on this before we move on?
I see that there's a project board. So if someone were to want to volunteer, do they go to that board? And how do they pick up issues?
Yeah, so the plan is once this merges, we'll file issues for all the remaining tasks, and those will go onto the board. And I'll make sure that any that are actively being worked on get assigned. So anything that's unassigned can be picked up.
Sounds good.
I might just defer this to later, but I don't know if anyone has any context. During the issue triage on Monday, we were trying to figure out if this issue ever made progress. So there was a few things. One was, is it technically possible to do service account key rotation? I don't actually know off the top of my head, which is, can you provide multiple keys in a way that you can rotate them? I don't actually remember if that was implemented. But more importantly, are there any docs around this? And do the docs cover the more difficult topics of long-lived like JOTs that are issued to components that don't know that you're rotating stuff? Micah, what's your hand?
Yeah, this kind of relates to the outstanding KEP that I've got going. But basically, yes, short answer is yes, you can rotate, but it requires an API server restart. And so you can provide multiple keys, and I think Kube API server basically takes like a JSON of the key and uses that as the key ID.
Okay. But I assume okay, do we have any docs around a okay.
Yeah.
Is there also any efforts to remove the restart requirement, like live reloading?
That's where the KEP comes in, mostly to support external signing and to have non-restart key updates.
Okay. Would you mind giving a TLDR as a comment on this issue?
Yeah. Yep, I can comment.
That would be great. And it might be out of scope for this, but the thing that still sticks in my mind is it's great if you can rotate keys, but you don't know who you issued identities to, and traditionally speaking, they've lasted forever. So forever is a very long time. I guess you could keep holding on to the public keys and throw away the private keys.
That's, yeah, you can only sign with one private key at a time, but you can have multiple public keys, so you can keep accepting old ones. And if you know that you signed with them for a certain amount of time, because you can configure the max life of the tokens, you can eventually phase it out.
This sounds painful, and even docs would be atrocious,
Yeah.
probably. Okay.
EKS rotates the key every week, every 7 days.
Okay.
But it's sort of transparent. You don't notice because we keep the old key around for a week, even though nothing's been signed with it after nothing's been signed with it after a week, but yeah.
Right. So in EKS, if I was to ask for a secret to be filled out with a service account token by the token controller, that would only actually work for a week. Like I couldn't hold on to it.
On the projected token, yeah, like the token request token, not the legacy one. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So it's much easier with the new style tokens because it's sort of implied that they're not supposed to last forever.
Yeah, the legacy ones we don't rotate.
Yeah. That's the one that's on my mind, right? Like that's the actual one I want to get rid of. Okay. Cool. That's good to know. Tim, I think you put the next topic in. Maybe.
I had one question. Are the legacy tokens not do they not use asymmetric? Like, are they just?
You can rotate those too, but you just need to keep the old public key around as long as any of the old tokens are around and they don't expire. So it's like kind of hard to get rid of them at all.
Oh, but they use a separate like root key.
Yeah. Okay. You get, because the key is given to the controller manager on the legacy ones, not the API server.
So you can do bad things like share the same key, or you can do good things like not sharing the key.
Right.
We don't.
Okay.
Stop.
Yeah, I think in GK we share the key and we just say, hey, if you, but we also don't transparently rotate it. We make you request it.
You can keep the old public keys around as long as you want on the API server.
Yeah. It's unfortunate though, because then if you ever lost a credential, right, and you didn't actually realize you lost it, that credential is probably still valid and has whatever RBAC is tied to it, and it's thus dangerous, right? Like part of the point of key rotation is that eventually stuff just expires and it's no longer a problem. Okay. Cool. Does anyone else have anything else on this one? No?
I just assigned it to Michael.
You just what?
Assign the issue to Micah.
Okay. I think I'll just put this in the backlog. This is gonna leave something. Cool. All right. So who put this one on? I don't remember. It's been a while because I think it was put on before last meeting. The question is in our agenda: does someone want to volunteer to be the reviewer of this? Yep. And I had asked, hey, Tim, you sound like a good guy, but I also realized, Tim, you're very busy. So
I'm happy to be a reviewer on this.
Did you want to talk about this at all? It's like some mixture of sig-node and a little bit sig-auth.
Yeah, do you want me to just give an overview of what this is proposing, or?
Yeah, if you didn't mind, like a 1 minute explanation of ambient capabilities, and then just
yeah, sure. So Linux capabilities are super confusing, mostly because they've been sort of bolted on and then over time realized that the thing that was bolted on was not sufficient. And so another thing was bolted on to that thing that was bolted on. And this has repeated in several iterations. And so the way capabilities work today in Kubernetes is essentially inherited from what Docker had at the time that Kubernetes came out. I don't even know if ambient capabilities existed when in Kubernetes 1.0. But basically, there's a bunch of different sets of capabilities that have slightly different meanings. And essentially, the set of capabilities that Kubernetes manages is the set that's available to the root user, more or less. And if you run a pod as a different user, it clears out the set of capabilities for that non-root user. The one exception is if you execute a binary that has file capabilities set, then you end up with the intersection of the capabilities on that file and the set. I can't remember if it's the bounding or effective set, which is like what you started with on the pod. So there's sort of a default set that comes with the pod, and then you can add or remove capabilities from that. But if you want to say, I don't want to run as root, but I need to run a web server that binds to port 80, let's say, then you need the net bind, it's net bind, capnet bind capability. And so you can't just say add capnet bind, because that gets dropped when you switch to the non-root user. So that's where ambient capabilities come in. They're basically capabilities that get that stick with you when you switch to a non-root user. This is kind of an oversimplification of all of this, but that's the basic motivation, is to be able to grant capabilities to non-root users, and that makes it much easier to actually run things as non-root users. But we don't want to just make everything an ambient capability because, for instance, set, I don't know, cap DAC override lets you basically ignore file permissions. If you grant that to a non-root user, they're getting pretty close to root. So there's a bunch of capabilities that you probably explicitly don't want to have on a non-root user. So what this is proposing is basically we don't touch the default set of capabilities. If it's in the default set, by default, it's also not in the ambient set. And then there's some mechanism by which you can explicitly add capabilities to the ambient set. There's some discussion on this about what that mechanism is, whether we override the add field or add a new field. But yeah, that's the kind of the gist of this KEP, is making it possible to somehow add capabilities to the ambient set. For containers.
Where are the container runtimes in terms of supporting this functionality? Because if I understand correctly, all Kubernetes is going to do is pass parameters down. At the simplification of this change is like we ask the container runtime to do something slightly different for us.
I don't remember off the top of my head. I think it's covered in the background section on this KEP. I think maybe they're going through a similar process right now of trying to figure out how to do this, and so this is sort of a collaboration with the runtimes, if I remember correctly. And we want to sort of figure out what it is that we want to do from the Kubernetes perspective to help shape the design decisions that the runtimes are making.
Do you know, in terms of release, like what this is targeting? Like I guess in my head, I would expect the container runtimes to have at least, I don't know, whatever their equivalent of beta support for this thing is before we try to start using it. I guess maybe it doesn't matter if it's an alpha, but certainly for us to be beta, they should at least be beta, or whatever their equivalent is.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't know. The PR says has alpha at 123.
I mean, this all sounds good. It sounds like basically add doesn't actually do what people normally mentally expect it to do. It does a slightly different thing.
Yeah, just skimming the PR right now, it does look like they're proposing adding changes to containerd and cryo.
Does anyone have anything on this before we go to the next one?
I guess the one thing I'll add is, I think from I think this mostly falls under sig-node's purview. But from a sig-auth perspective, we want to make sure that we have proper support in policies. So probably adding support to the new pod security controller, and depending on where the timeline lines up with the PSP deprecation, we may need to add support to PSP as well.
This might be too specific. It's probably in the KEP somewhere. I assume we'll probably have some kind of metrics or something to go with this functionality to, I don't know, help admins understand what's going on in their clusters. And I'm trying to understand, like, if I set this field, but like the runtime doesn't support it, like what is supposed to happen? Is it supposed to not work? Is it supposed to like try to work but fail in some weird way? I can certainly see it failing at the container runtime level. I'm just more curious if it would fail at the kube level.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know.
Rita, you want to start the next one? I think you were the one who put the next topic on the agenda about Sig-auth.
Sure. Before we go there, for this particular one, I just want to make sure, are we involving like folks from the container, like Containerd project? It seems like that's a pretty big dependency. I just want to, anyway, I can comment in the PR. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, I think what Tim had mentioned is there's folks both from Containerd and Cryo, because I would like more than one container runtime to support it, I guess, because you're not required to use Containerd.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, next item. I did add it to the call to the agenda, but I think Anish has created a doc, and I'll let Anish speak to the specific issue and the proposal.
Thank you. So just to give a brief overview of what the CSI driver is, it integrates external secret stores with Kubernetes, and then it implements the node plugin for the CSI interface. And the way it does that is it has the node plugin, and then when a volume is requested with the particular CSI driver, it talks to a provider, and then it fetches the secrets, and then all the secret is available to the pod on tempfs. So it's not, nothing is persisted on disk. And we support this for Linux and Windows. So in terms of the features that we have, the first thing is pod portability. So we have a custom resource where the user can provide which provider to use with a particular secret, and then a list of secret that they need to fetch from the secret store, and then also the identity information, right? And this was the primary functionality for the driver, and that is how it was implemented. And then the most widely requested feature on top of this was also being able to sync the mounted content as Kubernetes secret. And like, I think a compelling use case for this is to use the Kubernetes secret with ingress controllers, because they expect the TLS cert and TLS key to be part of it. And as part of that proposal, what we did in the CSI driver, in the secret store CSI driver community, was we added an optional feature on top of the mandatory mount to also sync it as a Kubernetes secret. So you would still need to sync all the contents you need in the mount. And on top of it, if you need to be needed to be in Kubernetes secret, you can add an optional field in the custom resource to tell the driver that also mirror these contents in Kubernetes secret. And we support that today. And on top of it, if the user wants to get environment variables, they can just reference certain data fields from the Kubernetes secret as environment variables in their pod. So this works well. And then this is also being used by a lot of users. And I think in terms of discussion, one particular topic that's been coming up lately is trying to decouple the sync as Kubernetes secret from the actual mount. So what users are really requesting is they want to only sync as Kubernetes secret. So they want to still be able to talk to the external secret store. So they like the architecture that we have today, but instead of doing the mount, they want to just sync it as Kubernetes secret. And then there's also another request on just being able to inject it as environment variables and not do syncing as Kubernetes secret or doing the mount part at all. And so the GitHub issue that we linked has context on that. So I put together this doc and just explaining how it works today, and then also what we would need to do to support it. But the TLDR is, if as a community we decide to support the decoupling from the mount and syncing as Kubernetes secret, then it sounds more like a different project. It wouldn't fall under CSI driver, because it's just a standalone controller which can piggyback on all the architecture that we have today. Basically, pluggable provider interface, using RPC to talk to any provider and then get the content, and then do whatever backend operation, being it mount or syncing as Kubernetes secret. So it would piggyback on using the same custom resources, using the architecture on how it would talk to the provider and then get the contents. But the only difference is, do we need to do the mount, or do we just want to explicitly do the sync as Kubernetes secret, or do we just inject it as an environment variables? And there are a couple of projects today available, not within Kubernetes, but like OSS projects that do this. So like using mutating webhooks or like having sidecars and then talking to the external secret store and fetching it. But this proposal is just to understand what sig-auth thinks about this. And then also, is this something that we want to support? So keeping the secret provider class custom resource as a base, and then building an ecosystem around it. And then that proposal is specifically for sync as Kubernetes secret.
So my initial gut reaction is, but I don't want my secrets inside of Kubernetes secrets. If I wanted to use Kubernetes secrets, I would just use Kubernetes secrets. I wouldn't use my very fancy vault with KMS plugins and everything else to like Kubernetes secrets are just not secret enough for me to want to use them for anything that I actually care about, right?
Right. But
I'd actually kind of disagree with you there, just because that's a standard API interface. And so if you've got an application that knows how to talk to Kubernetes to load information that says, okay, I know I can load it from a secret, I'm going to call that secret API. That's a really nice abstraction.
Right. I'm not
on top of the security concerns that you're bringing up.
Right. I'm not arguing about the abstraction. The abstraction is great. Kubernetes itself is a great abstraction. That's not like the relevant thing I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that I want to not store them inside of etcd. I don't want them available to the Kubernetes cluster, like infra in that way, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of usage, it's mostly around ingress scenarios, right? Because ingress still heavily depends on Kubernetes secret reference. And then that is what we see in terms of usage. Like they want to have the TLS cert and TLS key. And it just makes it easier for them to integrate it. And then it works well too, right? But I mean, if we decouple it, it's beneficial for users so that they don't have multiple operations that could fail before the last step that actually happens. But then again, there are also cons to the approach where it's a diversion from the current approach of the project. So we have to see if it's a totally different project, or then also how do we support something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I wish Mike was here because I know he had done a lot of the initial reviews for the CSI Secret Driver to make it a sig-auth sub-project. What you're describing is, in my opinion, a different project, right? Which, I mean, I could certainly see, like library components that are like a third, like, you can imagine 3 repos. There's some other thing, there's the CSI driver, and then there's a third repo that's just a foundational library code that they can both use to do whatever they want. But I would find it strange that a repo called the CSI driver didn't actually use a CSI driver, or at least in a lot of installations didn't. So maybe as next steps, we could send this out to the mailing list and see if we can get folks' opinions. I'd be very interested in like what Mike has to say. And I feel a little bit strange changing the scope of an existing project. But sig-auth doesn't have many projects, so I don't necessarily have like a good indication of like, we can change the scope and just change the name of it or something and be like, yeah, it does more stuff now. That's fine. But I just don't think there's any precedence one way or the other. So.
Yeah, I think there's just enough people asking for it that we think we should evaluate if it makes sense to create another sub-project.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you do have to meet users where they are. Right?
Yeah.
Your ivory tower security is great until it like doesn't actually work for anyone.
Yeah.
So. Okay. Does anyone have anything else you want to talk about on this? Any thoughts, concerns?
Cool. I'll just send it out to the mailing list. And then probably I'll also add it as a follow-up for the next call, just to see if there's any feedback.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and then I think the only thing we have left is the service accounts MTLS pre-kept. I think Ted, was that you who posted this?
Yeah, and Tahir has an excellent document that also deserves review. I have a version of the KEP that is cleaned up and simplified down to the point where it is just adding as an alternative to tokens, adding to the existing projected token a TLS certificate that serves precisely the same purpose. And it does not have, there's a lot of things unfilled in here. But I would like to get agreement on we should connect from service accounts that rather than using tokens, we should also provide a TLS-based mechanism for connecting to the API server as part of the projected token volume. Or next to the projected token volume. That's also up for discussion.
So I have not read the Google Doc. I have read the KEP, much shorter than the Google Doc, and I just didn't get to the Google Doc. So one of the things that sort of stuck out to me is maybe this was just in the process of trying to reduce it down to like one directed use cases. I didn't find enough technical details around like how some of this would be implemented for me to like say like that this is a good idea.
Sure.
So there's that. Like like at a high level, some concerns I have, like we support revocation for service account tokens. We don't support revocation certificates. So does this kept care? Is there some gotchas? There's a lot of extra validation that service account tokens go through and checks along, like, how they're bound to pods and stuff. How do you plan on doing that? Because we don't have the machinery to do that with certificates today. So those are some things. Also, I felt like if we changed some stuff in core, that didn't necessarily change many APIs, or if any. I mean, it might expand how we validate certificates some, but if we expanded that out, I didn't necessarily see something that could not be implemented out of tree, even if it was destined to come into tree at some point. But those are just some like initial thoughts I had. But like to me, the largest thing was like, I just don't see enough details to like be like, yeah, this is what you plan on implementing, and that's a good idea or a bad idea.
Everything that I have, brought to this committee, to this group, has been implementable out of tree, with the exception of it requires signing by the actual keys used by the API server, and those are gated behind signers. I think that's really it, is that this is about adding a signer that you can use for service accounts. Because that signer, regardless of what security controls are in place, needs to be there for any of the rest of this to work.
So I think even that is implementable out of tree. If you want to reuse the base signer, you just need a custom approver, and then the signer will dumbly act on any approved CSR. Those are separate phases, and it's
you can sign.
It's about you can sign certificates externally to that. It's that a signer that is using the same key that the Kubernetes API server already recognizes. Right? Because unless you have access to unless you have a signer that has another copy of the CA certificate of the CA that the Kubernetes API server is using, it won't be recognized by the API server.
What we were saying, Ted, though, is if you make a CSR that says the CN is system : service account : foo : bar, and you make that CSR targeted at the API server client signer, I can't remember the exact name right now, and you approve it, and that signer is functioning on the cluster, which it is everywhere but EKS. Micah, I'm shaking my hand to you. That will get signed, and then when you try to use it, the identity will match mostly. That's where some caveats start coming in, but it will look like a service account. Like RBAC would treat it like a service account. They'll just split the name and be like, yep, that's a service account and foo namespace with the name bar. Go crazy.
None of the existing signers have will allow you to say service account. Will
the API server client one does not care what you put in the CN as long as the usages are fine, right? So it will happily let you sign for anything that you want. Like if it is approved,
okay.
Fine, right? The problems that you start getting into though is the fact that that certificate, when authenticated against the API server, will not be validated in exactly the same way. So for example, it won't be able to perform any UID checks because there is no UID to check against. And it won't be able to do any like pod checks because there's no place to put the pod information, right?
Right.
Those are the types of things I would like to see fixed in core, because once you have those, then you don't need to put anything else in core, right? And those properties I would like to just see in general. Like I would like to be able to say, I have a certificate for this user in these groups with this UID with these extra fields. Right? I would like to be able to say that, because then it would complete the whole thing.
Right.
The sort of the more controversial idea I had in my head was it would be interesting to in the somewhere in this cap there was like, this is only meant for service accounts and it's only meant to be used against the API server, and no other entity should care at all about these certs. Am I remembering that right, Ted? You said that.
Right, but I say that in this proposal, yes.
Right. I was curious what folks felt about trying to enforce that more strongly. Right. So like the way I would think about that is like a required critical extension on the client cert, which would then make everyone else in the world be like, I don't know what this is, go away. Even if they had the same trusted CA bundle, if you were reusing the CA across environments.
So I think, so we're implementing something like this internally at Google, and we do include sort of critical extensions for pod UID, that kind of thing. I don't think we should try to, I don't know if that counts as enforcing that only Kube API server will understand this. It's just enforcing that if a third party is going to accept this certificate, they need to understand that it's a Kubernetes certificate.
Right. I think if you had that bar and maybe some concept of an audience, right? So like, this is meant to be a service account cert for Kubernetes use cases, and here's the targeted API server that I was trying to talk to. Like if you had both of those things, if some external entity wants to parse those out and trust them and understand them, whatever, I don't care. Like, but the idea is if I was to present it to like an old API server or any other thing that supports MTLS in the world, it would immediately say, no, like I don't care that your cert is signed by a CA that I trust. I don't understand what that extension means, go away.
My objective is actually pretty much precisely the opposite of this, in that I want these certificates to use the standard I would like to get to a world where existing TLS implementations are able to take advantage of some of these things, and that we are able to have a PKI infrastructure within Kubernetes that does not require you rewriting all of your existing programs to understand this new variant of PKI infrastructure. There's certainly a lot to be said for adding all of these capabilities, for adding information about here is the effective service account, but here is the actual pod that it's related to. And there's certainly something to be said for making that critical if you can. But there is a migratory period, and there's that migratory period is actually sort of undergoing right now. And one of the main problems of migrating to something like Istio is that you have to that you have that you end up in a bit where you trust Istio blindly to be doing these things rather than you actually understanding who you're talking to and what their PKI situation is.
So I would say that is fine, but I would want that sort of written out as goals so that way we could think through it and talk about it. Because what I see is a different, what you described.
Absolutely, this is a different proposal. This is a proposal to make something that is super tightly scoped to prove the concept, and this, I don't think that you need specific, because you already have the API server client type, and that will sign anything. And adding pod information to those signed certificates is very reasonable. But if they are scoped more tightly than the API server client is already, just by nature of being bound to a projected volume, the chances that they leak are much lower than the already accepted chances of your CI system leaking its private key and certificate, right? If you are using this API server client to sign a long-lived or medium lifetime certificate that you're going to put on your CI system, for example, the possibility of leaks is already much greater than the possibility of leaks from a pod running within the cluster. That is, and especially since it is the private key is never intentionally shown to anything but a single pod.
Yeah, Mo, earlier you mentioned something about wanting an audience. And I think the audience is critical in OIDC because OIDC tokens are forwardable.
Right.
But MTLS doesn't have that.
So I'm well aware of that. The concern I have is I get relatively frequent requests from customers that want to use their corporate PKI as their Kubernetes PKI, and that's like foundationally unsafe to do today. And I would like to make that not foundationally unsafe, right? And the only way to do that is for Cube to say, I can trust this CA, it's cool, I'll trust it for everything. But if you send me stuff that doesn't explicitly say it's meant for me, I will reject it. I won't care that it's signed by the right CA, right? And then you start being able to actually use your corporate PKI.
Why is that foundationally unsafe?
It's foundationally unsafe because you can't do CN constraints, because any sub CA of your PKI can create a service account at that point.
Right, like as a for example, right? Like I could make an issue to like the VMware IT and ask them to provision me a certificate for some app I'm building or whatever. And then if anywhere within VMware that CA is trusted by Kubernetes, I can go present to Kubernetes and be like, cool, you're this random identity that I have no idea what it is. And I don't know how to validate it in any meaningful way, right? That's like one direction, and there's other issues on the other direction too, but like.
I think there's actually a real argument that is a valid solution, so long as Kubernetes is set with exactly the set of intermediate CAs that it's set to. Having the Kubernetes cluster chain up to the corporate PKI is totally a valid security model, if not one that we want to encourage without careful consideration.
So, I mean, I have giant documents internally that outline every one of the things that can go wrong, which effectively always end in never use your internal PKI with Kubernetes, because the risk is too high to your internal PKI effectively.
I don't disagree, but I'm going to yell about these small corporations, these small companies where the set of Kubernetes certificates is actually a reasonable set of PKI, and just not having rather than having a single root, you concatenate all of your Kubernetes clusters, and that is a reasonable PKI.
Mo,
Yes.
I'd be interested in if you could take a look at the doc I wrote, the service account certs for serving.
Sorry, I
It
just
kind of
couldn't
lays
get
out.
to it in time.
No, it's not a problem, and it's not really a proposal. It's just it's kind of like there was some interest a few weeks back around like why Google does it that way, and we're at least on GK the way we're kind of thinking about this is you can have one PKI that may or may not be your internal corporate PKI,
Mhm.
and it can span multiple clusters, and that's fine. You define a domain of 20 clusters, 1,000 clusters, regionally separated or whatever, but the identities across them are the same within reason. You can take a cert for default/default and show up at another cluster and be default/default with special guards for like, oh, probably kube system/default shouldn't be showing up at another cluster that is based on this like
But
having
like,
a separate.
I'm sad Dave is not here because I'm pretty sure he'd have like an aneurysm at the idea that that service accounts across clusters are like the same identity, right? Because I mean, it depends on how you think about your Kubernetes clusters, right? I think of all of my Kubernetes clusters as distinct domains, right? I don't want them crossing other than in some very carefully curated way. And generally speaking, the carefully curated way is human identities, right? Like Mo can log into all of his Kubernetes clusters and still Mo, right? I don't expect, I don't know, my banking app running over here and my healthcare app running over there with some service accounts would like somehow like mean the same thing across clusters. Don't make
So sure, you don't make those chained to the same PKI then.
Right.
Yeah, no, of course. But that's the thing though, right? Like what I want is the ability to reuse the same PKI but keep things separate, right? Like the reason for reusing the same PKI is because a lot of corporations like to know exactly what certificates are issued and where they are, right? They don't want random self-signed certs or whatever. It's a compliance issue for them, and it's just not what they're used to doing, right? But instead of continuously having arguments about, well, just don't do this, it's unsafe. Here's a giant document saying why it's unsafe. I would much rather say, it's safe now. This is why it's safe. Go for it. Have at it. Don't ask me no questions anymore, right?
The problem with
so like a
audience
required critical
constraints-
extension.
Sorry, what?
Yeah, the problem with audience constraints in my mind is very simple, that they are they're on behalf of the signer, that the signer is the one asserting the audience constraints, and the signer can assert whatever it wants for those audience constraints, or it can simply choose not to assert them. And then you have problems down the line. And I don't know what those are, but because I haven't even considered.
So kind of like a required critical extension that says, hey, you're using PKI, some random PKI, but here's an assertion, like a signature from the cluster specific CA, proving that it came from this cluster. So
Yeah,
then
I mean,
customers who care about the cluster provenance can default deny anything else. And in situations where you don't care about the cluster provenance, for example, you're running the same app across a set of clusters just for geo-replication or something like that.
Even the same app running across clusters for geo-replication, I don't know why my app would be like trying to talk to the other copy of itself on the other side of the world.
Well, then you haven't been a site reliability engineer at Google then.
Sorry,
yeah,
what?
it would not be trying to talk to the same copy of itself, right? It would be talking to some backend service, and it's talking to it through a load balancer, and something blew up in cluster A, so all traffic has to be drained over to cluster B.
Yeah, that's basically it. Is that for every copy, if you have ABC in your service dependencies, then you should have cluster A's A, B, C. You should have cluster B's A, B, C, and cluster, the first cluster number one's A, B, C should be capable of talking to A, should be capable of talking to cluster two's B, and cluster one's B should be capable of talking to cluster two's C, and vice versa, as is necessary to keep your application alive.
So I could buy that, but I would consider all of those distinct identities, and they should be authenticated and authorized as such, and totally fine.
And those are absolutely authenticated and authorized as such because the CA chains differently.
Kubernetes lacks the ability to authenticate and authorize them distinctly, right? Once you're authenticated, it doesn't matter how you got authenticated, right? System strings, right? And like RBAC has zero concept of how you got there, and like.
And if you don't want Kubernetes talking to all of these things, then you should not reuse the same CA certificate as the root for all of your Kubernetes clusters. But if you treat all of your clusters the same, then there is no reason why you shouldn't trust that cluster B, which has its own intermediate cert that chains up to your root PKI, that its service account isn't the same as cluster A, which has its own intermediate cert that chains up to your root PKI. I think there are a lot of considerations here that the average corporate PKI team has never considered, but that is a problem of the average corporate PKI team having terrible security constraints and issuing certificates willy-nilly, not that you can't build a good crypto system around this.
So I personally see this trying to optimize for a case that is the minor case, right? I think most people don't want their identities crossing, but they do want to share the info because that's the easy thing to do and technically the compliant thing to do based on their own requirements, right? No self-signed certs, always use corporate PKI, always know every cert that's issued, blah.
And so I suspect you see a very disjoint set of customers that some other people see.
Well, yes.
Because I would have the opposite impression. Like from who I talk to, people are all about, I use my clusters as, I have one in the US West, I have one in Japan. When I spin up one in Africa, I don't want to go and change all my RBAC rules everywhere just to permit this new geo-replication or load balancing. Those applications have the same identity globally.
And so I see both. As someone who is small and talks to some of the bigger players, I do see both. But that said, the problems with using a shared corporate CA infrastructure are that you are using your CAs inappropriately, that you should be it's entirely okay to put intermediate certs as root certs for specific applications. Your Kubernetes API server should have its own intermediate cert as the how do I verify clients certificate, whereas other applications that are talking to each see the root cert to which all of the Kubernetes individual clusters chain, because they want to ignore the fact that these are separate domains. That you can have these sub-constraints in a very simple tree by just having good intermediate certs.
So I've seen people try to do the intermediate thing and it doesn't actually work right in Kube. Like you can present the full chain and Kube will trust it even though you only have an intermediate as what's trusted on a cluster. I remember this at Red Hat.
That is actually correct. Presenting the full chain and is fine if the trusted certificate is somewhere in that chain. You don't have to. You can present a chain, and this is part of just how X509 works. Is you can present a chain that roots further up, but you don't care about that. You only care that your CA, your trusted list, that it routes to one of the routes in your trusted list, even if you could go beyond that.
Right, but that's what I'm saying. Then the intermediate doesn't actually provide any value. Right? It doesn't actually make you have distinct domains. They're still
They're not distinct domains so long as you're talking to, so long as you are authenticating to the root CA. But you can say, I only trust this intermediate cert, and it won't trust from a different intermediate cert.
At least the way I've been thinking about this, when I think about this, is that the CA that backs these service account certificates may not necessarily be the cluster CA. It could be a separate CA. And that is the brush you use to paint this sameness or not.
Yeah.
I think it's you're right. It's probably not a great idea to have the cluster CA be chained to some random on-prem thing. That should be scoped to the cluster. But the identities issued by the cluster may not be solely cluster local. If you want them to be solely cluster local, then yeah, make them be backed by the cluster CA or the API server client CA. I don't know, we've got like 10 CAs now in a cluster. I
mean, the fundamental problem is that most large corporations have one PKI and then use that for everything, and should actually have multiple PKIs for individual departments and individual scopes and portions, and they don't have the ability to manage that because they just, compliance reasons and compliancy things. I don't think that we want
over time.
Yeah.
So I want to be respectful of his time. I'm open to continuing this discussion. Hopefully there's more than like Rita and myself from the leads here, so that way we can keep talking about this. Yeah, I mean, overall though, I don't necessarily think, I think some variation of this step can probably make it into Cube at some point. I don't think that's necessarily an issue. I think we just need to distill it down to what we think we need to actually put in.
I will go build a demonstration of this because I already have 90% of what I need to issue secrets to pods. But I'd like to see some variation of this, make it mainline, even if the broader discussion of how do we do stuff is tabled.
Okay. We'll see y'all in 2 weeks. I guess.
Thank you.